Well, welcome back to another one of our studies in Colossians. Today, we're looking at Colossians 3:18 and ending with the first verse of chapter 4. So follow along as I read. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you'll receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Well, Paul is coming to the end of Colossians and he's giving some further instructions. And he begins with what's known as a household code, which were very common in the day that Paul wrote. The Greeks had them, the Romans had them, they had them in different forms and so on. So this is a Christian household code. What is interesting, at that time, this was rather radical stuff he was saying. And in fact, there was no kind of comparable code that was as far-reaching in its change of things as was the Christian household code, because it went beyond what the Jews had ever said. It went beyond what the Greeks had said. And we'll talk about that as we go along here, and certainly as the Romans as well. It talks about wives submitting themselves to their husbands with a qualifier, as is fitting in the Lord. Now, that means not in everything. It means that those, for example, if a husband would say to a wife that she's to do something that goes against what the Lord has said in his word, that's not fitting and that's not right, and it's not required of the wife. It is, and it says, flipping that over, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Now, in these days, women had no rights. We've talked about this before. They had no rights. They had no standing. In fact, the Greeks had it where, and then on into the Roman society, that if you were a proper woman, essentially, when you got married, you didn't go out by yourself in public. You were kept pretty much in your home. And when the men sat down to eat, you were not allowed to eat with them. All this kind of thing. And so women were very, very much oppressed, even in the wealthier homes. And a lot of times when we see how homes are portrayed in movies and so on, they're really 21st century kind of values that they put back. They put the old clothes on them, but that's not really how it was. Women were not allowed to say too much or do too much in these days. And of course, they were denied education. They were denied any kind of rights. So it's not unusual that Paul would say that they're to submit to their husbands because, again, the husbands were the ones who had to represent the family and everything. But the men were told to love their wives. Now, back in these days, again, that wasn't really required. You just had a wife, essentially to keep your family line going, to manage the household. You didn't have to love her. And there was no idea of faithfulness to the wife. The wife was to be faithful to the husband, but the husband did not have to be faithful to the wife. And so it was very uneven. But when Christianity came along, there was this reciprocal kind of relationship that was introduced, that wives were to do this, but husbands also had an obligation to do that. And so it meant there was more of an equalization between the sexes, and that this began to change not just the home, but society as a whole, because women were allowed more and more expression. They were treated better by their husbands. And when wives were treated better, naturally, they were better wives. That makes sense, doesn't it? So we had that going on. And also, we get to the next thing about children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they would become discouraged. Again, back in these days, children had no rights. A child by Roman law, A child could be sold in slavery. A child could be forced to be like a farm laborer by the parents. The parents get the money. A child had no rights. A child was not to speak up. A child could not in any way have that. And so, of course, children became angry sometimes, and they became disobedient. And so Paul is saying, now, look, kids, you have to behave yourselves. You have to do what your parents say. After all, they have lived longer, they know more. And again, you have to have some order in the home. But by the same token, fathers, do not be so hard and harsh with your children, because you don't want to discourage them. And there is this thing, we who have been parents and raised children, there's this line between giving them instruction. You have to instruct them. You have to tell them things they don't like to hear. You have to sit down and correct them. You've got to do that. But by the same token, you don't want to do it to the place where they lose all confidence. They don't feel like they can do anything right. And so and it's not like you can use the same formula for every child. If you've had more than one child, you'll know if you have two children, they're not alike. That's just that they're going to be different, and they're going to act differently, and they respond differently because they're different individuals. And again, if you've had siblings, you know that the way each one of your brothers or sisters interacted with the parents, it was a little bit different because we are individuals. And so we have to be aware of that. Now, I think some parents go too far and their children actually rule the home. That's not good. And that doesn't help the children feel secure. In fact, it's totally wrong. And it ends up creating more problems than the parents will solve, because they don't want to sit down and do the hard things that parenting requires. Well, this is not a lecture on parenting, but I think we just need to say those things right now. Well, we go on to the next section where it talks about slaves. Now, fortunately, there's no formalized slavery in the world anymore. But in fact, we know there's human slavery. We know there's people who are kept in bondage in different ways. And those folks, one of the reasons we are so against it is because it's so dehumanizing, and they are treated like property. They are they have no rights, and it's just a wicked thing. And even back in these days, part of the problems of slavery were beginning to emerge, and people were starting to fight against it. Now, some people criticize Christianity because it didn't come out right and say stop slavery. But if it had, what good would it have done? No one's going to listen to him. No one's going to do anything, and it had no influence to do that. But what it did, again, it started in the home. It started in this city. How slaves and masters were to relate to each other had to change. So Paul gives some instructions to the slaves, because, of course, if a slave wanted to get back at his master, all he had to do was not do what he was supposed to, or do it in a sloppy way, or undermine the master. And so he's saying, again, based on the fact that you're a Christian, your conduct as a slave has to be different. Now, in our day, we can say, in that you're a Christian, your conduct as an employee has to be different. So if we apply some of these same principles to employees and bosses, if we can say that, then we have to look at what Paul is saying. Where you work, he's saying, don't do things just so you can curry favor, so you can have people say, oh, what a great guy you are, but do it with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. It is a gift to the Lord, and your workplace is the vessel that God is using. And look at this 23rd verse. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for human masters. When we do our work, Christians ought to be presenting the best work of anyone in a workplace. Now, we're not all equally talented. We're not in equal positions. We acknowledge that. But we ought to be giving the best work, and so that the person who is supervising us can say, you can trust her because she'll do it right. She'll give it her best shot. He can be trusted with the resources, because and they'll hopefully know that you are a believer and that you stand for the Lord, and that is the kind of person you want to have in your workplace. And remembering this, that we're not just working for the pay that we get today. We're working for an inheritance, Paul says, from the Lord. There's another reward, not just your paycheck, that's coming from the Lord. So those people who kind of do a sloppy job with their work and have a don't care attitude, if they claim to be Christians, they are absolutely going against what the Lord wants. There's no excuse for it. There's a thing that I heard any number of times coming along when I was growing or younger, and still coming again, especially young officer, is it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. And that may be true, but that's not the Christian way of doing things. We ought not to have that attitude that I don't care what the rules are, I'll do what I darn well please, and so on. That's not the way we should be doing things. We should be doing things with absolute integrity and giving it the best that we have. And Paul says, as a warning, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Be careful. Now, on the other side of that, he's saying to the masters or to the bosses, you do what's right and fair. An unfair boss is if you've ever worked for someone like this, it's maddening. And you wonder, you say, I did my work, and so, and what was the result? Well, they still didn't give me credit, or they treated, they had this other person they liked better, and so on. We need to be right and fair. We need to be equal in our treatment of others. It ought to be, and I would say this to officers toward their core people, it ought to be that even though in our heart of hearts we may have favorites because we just click with some people and just get along better with some people, that no one knows who they are because we treat everybody right and fair. Nobody knows what our affections are. And if we don't like somebody, because sometimes we just don't like some people, they don't know that either, because we're fair with them and we treat them right. So why is that? And Paul reminds them, you have a master in heaven. You have somebody that you're working for. So what Christianity has said in these kinds of passages is that everybody has rights, but everybody has obligations as well. Now, that's something for you to think about this week as you go forward, and ask the Lord how you should be with your rights, but also your obligations, and how you act and treat others. God bless you.